In this video I'll be talking you through how I made my two-part mould. Before I began, I first sculpted my nose onto the cast. I primarily used my fingers to sculpt because after a lot of different trials of tools I found that using my fingers was the easiest way to get the basic desired shape which I wanted. Another reason that using my fingers to sculpt the clay worked better was because I used an oil-based clay. Now, although oil-based clays are often hard to work with, once they have been warmed they have a much more workable consistency. This is why I decided using my fingers would be best, since my natural body heat would help heat up the clay, making it easier to work with. Another reason I decided to use oil-based clay is because it is a great clay to add detail to pieces, because you can be pretty rough with your sculpt and not worry about squishing parts of the form or making huge marks in the clay with a tiny amount of pressure. The pouring of casting material isn't likely to squish any parts of your mould either. Another thing that I liked about this clay was the fact that if you make a mark that you didn't want to make, lighter fluid can be used for smoothing and buffing surfaces, refining edges and getting rid of tool marks. However, obviously it is important to remember that if using products like lighter fluid, it needs to be used correctly and the manufacturer's guidelines should be adhered to. It's also a good idea when using products like this for makeup artists to have the correct insurances. This is down to the fact that if anything was to go wrong whilst using this product, the artist would be covered for any loss or damage caused by the product as long as they had adhered to the manufacturer's guidelines. Moving on from this, once I was happy with the shape of the sculpt, as you can see from the video, I then went in with my loop tool to even out the sculpt and to blend away the edges. I use the loop tool because it is specifically designed to remove product, which is a necessity when trying to blend away any rough edges. At this stage I took great care when blending because, as Stuart Bray said in a recent interview, the prosthetic has to blend seamlessly into the skin and it requires the sculpture to have tapering edges which become feather thin at the point at which the sculpture stops and the real skin begins. In the same interview, Bray talks about how the success of a prosthetic piece depends on the artist's understanding of anatomy. He explained how the artist needs to consider the anatomy of the face and where the piece is actually going to fit and where the edges would need to be so that they could be blended without being visible to the naked eye. This is something that I decided to take into consideration when sculpting my own nose and flat mould pieces. Once I was happy with the edges, I then went in with my texture stamp. I created my stamp in the exact same way that I made my flat moulds. It's important to add texture to the sculpt because it helps add imperfections to the clay that are similar to the skin. This in turn helps camouflage the piece when it is applied. Once I was happy with the texture which had been applied to my sculpt, I quickly ran a stipple sponge over to burnish it. Burnishing is a process which helps remove tool marks from the sculpt and again adds to the authenticity of a piece. Once I was happy with the sculpt, I began preparing for the making of my two-part mould. I started by applying a clay flashing across the rest of my mould, including the sides. I made sure to leave half a centimetre around the edges of my sculpt in order to create the cap plastic blending edge. I made sure that I had carved out the keyholes as well so the mould could lock back in place. Once I was happy with the overall outline of the flashing, you can see that I go back in and start to smooth over all the edges and carve around the entire edge of the flashing at a 45-degree angle to ensure that the cap plastic can reach all the areas of the blending edge. You can see from the video I used an oil-based clay to create my flashing. The only reason that I used this clay is because it was the clay that was used in the demonstration that I was shown at university. However, it would have been possible to create the flashing out of wet clay, which would have been easier to work with and would have been a lot cheaper. However, the only issue that I have with sculpting with wet clay from previous experiences is that it's very hard to remove from plaster once the plaster has set around it. Makeup artist Stephanie Kemp in a recent interview also said how she preferred to work with oil-based clay when working on smaller sculpts, as she found it gave the best effect and was the easiest to remove from the plaster. This part of the video shows when I was carving around the edge of my sculpt at a 45-degree angle to create the blending edge for my sculpt. It's important to take care at this stage when working with sharp tools because they could cause serious damage to an artist if they aren't used correctly. Once I was happy with the finished sculpt, I placed it on a tile and positions around the edge of it wed clear, which was 1 cm thick. This ensures that the mould will not lock together due to the fact that it leaves a centimetre of the positive mould sticking out from the negative mould when completed. Next, I began positioning my shim around the cast, trimming away any excess that wasn't needed. I began to manipulate the shim into the clay, ensuring it was 1 cm away from the cast at all times. Once positioned, I secured with tape. It's important to remember that when working with shim, it is a very sharp material and it is possible to cause severe injuries if you aren't paying attention when using it. This is why I took great precautions when working with this material, not only to protect myself, but I ensured that I used it in a quiet room where there was no risk of anybody tripping and falling onto it, which again could have caused another serious injury. I then sprayed a layer of epoxy parfilm over the mould to prevent it from locking. I decided to advance from using petroleum jelly as my mould release to this due to the fact that the epoxy parfilm is an ultra thin release agent which is non-melting and will not carbonise. This means that it is ideal for exothermic products such as plaster. Another reason that industry professionals such as Neil Gorton love it is because due to the fact that the product only produces a very fine layer of product, the cast fidelity is unaffected. The only thing that you need to remember when using this product is that when it is sprayed you are wearing goggles, a mask and are working in a well ventilated room. It is also important to ensure that everyone around is also wearing the correct PPE equipment because the product can be very harmful to health and cause serious damage if inhaled. Next I began to mix my plaster. I decided to mix the plaster to a thicker consistency due to the fact that I would need less product to create the mould. It would set quicker and would set harder. As you can see, I use my hands to mix the plaster because I like to be able to feel the consistency of the plaster so that I know if it is completely mixed or not. However, if you are using your hands, it is always recommended that you wear gloves for health and safety reasons since the plaster is exothermic and could potentially cause burns if it is left on the hands for too long. This is one area where I didn't adhere to the manufacturer's guidelines, however I felt comfortable enough to do so and I knew I would have only myself to blame if anything went wrong. However, after speaking to my tutor, she agreed with my method for the exact reasons that I gave, whereas in an interview with makeup artist Stephanie Kemp, she explained to me how she would never work with plaster without wearing gloves because despite her knowing that she probably would be okay, she wasn't willing to take the chance, and she also liked the fact that it looks more professional for an artist to use gloves when working with plaster. Although I can see Kemp's point of view on the matter and I can agree with her idea of it looking more professional, this is one area of my technique that I wasn't willing to change. Once the plaster was mixed to the correct consistency, I began to pour it over my sculpt. I showed two methods in this video to demonstrate which is better when working with plaster that has been mixed to a thicker consistency. Usually plaster is poured from a height to reduce the amount of air bubbles that are in the mould. However, as you can see in the video, when this is done the plaster is very sloppy and splatters a lot, which in turn creates more air bubbles, which is something we were trying to prevent. This is why I opted for the second method, which was using my hands to scoop and place the plaster into the mould. I also preferred this method as well because as you can see I was able to manoeuvre the plaster and drag it up towards the centre of the sculpt, which as you can see from the video meant that less product was needed to create the mould. Although it seems very stingy trying to use the least amount of product possible, it is such an important skill for a makeup artist to have and is something that I've really tried to focus on during this module. This is due to the fact that out in industry a makeup artist is expected to work to very limited budgets. So I've decided that by setting myself the challenge of working as cost efficiently as possible now, then in the future when I work out in industry I will be able to work to the budgets that are set.
Across the carriageway and then into a pub car park.
Then the desperate driver does something no one expects. Least of all, his pursuer.
The sight that I'll never forget is turning into the car park and then just driving into this large body of water. And to see it happen in front of you at speed when it was the last thing I was expecting. Breathtaking. I couldn't believe what had happened.
Right.